Blackness often has to be performed in its most reduced form in order for it to be visible or recognizable or get attention from outsiders. Hi besties, and welcome to another episode on The Western Gaze. Now this episode is going to be short, but it'll pack a punch, so maybe we can take a beat to do some catching up and housekeeping just to soften the landing. How are you? It's the holiday season, so I suddenly have a year's worth of work to do in 1 month. But I've got weddings to attend and Arctic circles to visit, so I'm pretty much taking it on the chin. Alright, enough of that. Let's get to the real reason you clicked on this video. I also want to preface this by reminding you the goal of the content I'm creating in this space. It's not and will never be an attack on anybody. My main purpose is to speak on topics that affect, influence, mold, or simply have the chance to validate the different cultures and experiences of Africans in the diaspora and the continent as a whole, really. And even if you don't see how it has anything to do with us, it'll still meet the conditions based on the fact that it's coming out of an African woman's mouth. Of course, if you don't identify as such, there's still an opportunity to hear and engage with someone you don't necessarily relate to. So that said, imagine, if you will, that you're scrolling through social media, or if you're one of those people that still have a television, imagine you're flipping through the endless channels and you come across an ad for, let's say, a nondescript charity organization operating in Africa to feed little orphans or teach African women in remote villages a non-specific trade to empower themselves and or help support their families, because they are, in this hypothetical universe no doubt, unsupported by their male partners or the fathers of their children. While the video might start with sad melodic music as a fly settles on the dust-covered face of a needy child, at some point, probably towards the end of the video, you're very likely going to see dancing kids and or women possibly celebrating the deliverance of the charity at the hands of the General West. What am I even saying? Why put in the effort to imagine all of this when this exists?
This is Joshua. He's hungry. Today, he's not eaten any food. Literally nothing. He's not just hungry, he's starving. In all reality, Joshua will die of hunger-related disease, maybe not today, but not that too long in the future. He'll join the other 11,000 children who die daily of hunger-related diseases. Joshua's issue is that he's an orphan. His guardian neighbour is trying to raise her own 3 children by herself and then also look after Joshua and his little sister. But she has no job. How do you put food in the belly of your own children, let alone your dead neighbour's children? She tries, but what's her chances? She's got no education, she's got no unemployment benefits, she's got no social security. It's not that she's fallen through the cracks of the system, there is no system. She literally has no way to put food into Joshua's belly. You know, for 17 cents, food can be put in his belly. $35 a month will give him an education to empower him out of the cycle of poverty. And the good news is, you can join this movement. You can be a part of helping this Joshua and many other Joshuas.
What you've just seen is a common byproduct of the Western gaze. The stereotype of African people as helpless and dependent on Western help is one created by decades of what could be assumed to have been, at one point or another, well-meaning promotion in the West that I think we can all agree is arguably way more dangerous than helpful at this point. With all these images of sad, dirty children with eyes that call you to urgently donate money, it really isn't surprising that the idea of the helpless African is a common belief that pervades thinking across the globe. Even that of nations who might find themselves in worse conditions, who console themselves with the fact that at least they're not African. So that's one side of this double-edged sword. Let's look at the other side. Particularly in the Western media, The way that Africa has been portrayed over time is interesting to say the least. Initially, Africa was largely portrayed as impoverished and mostly disconnected from the experiences of the rest of the world, as we've just unpacked. The only time the continent was in the Western media was when children with distended bellies were captured on camera during the promotion of a fundraiser meant to save the starving children, or when the West was condemning, and rightly so, some political instability in one region or another. But in recent history, this constant misrepresentation has garnered criticism from enlightened Africans and allies from other races and countries who began to see the danger of the stereotype. In a suspicious effort to course correct and maybe even to compensate for the earlier wrong, Western media, or at the very least the left media, began leaning heavily into focusing on the artistry and cultural dynamics of the African people. This involved portraying a more romanticized image of Africans as simple-minded people whose only valuable inclinations are in the arts, culture, and aesthetics. A group of people whose virtue manifests from creative expressions, specifically dance, even when everything else around them and in their lives is going wrong or falling apart. Now, because we here all know better, we know this other extreme portrayal is simply not true. This overly artistic and oversimplified version as an alternative to the depleted image of Africa is still itself a stereotype, one we shouldn't accept. The idea that all that Africans are capable of is creative expression through dancing to a drum beat is incredibly condescending. Now, I'll be the first to admit that we have problems. A lot of them. Like a concerning amount. But we certainly don't and obviously cannot solve our problems by singing songs, dancing, and doing all things artsy. My people dance a lot, and they do so in many scenarios, but this simply doesn't justify the kind of dancing we're sometimes encouraged and oftentimes compelled to do in front of the media. The problem lies with the consumer, the spectator, the person watching at the other end of the screen. What tends to happen is that because there's no real insight or understanding, people just tend to deviate towards stereotypes. Now, of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with donating to the less privileged, nor is there an issue with celebrating any small gifts, charities, and graces that one might be provided during a time of need. Neither is it a sin to showcase the artistry and creativity that comes from the continent, of course. The issue, as you will have gathered, is the way that these individuals are more often than not portrayed. The West has a negrophilia problem. I mean, the West has a lot of problems in general, but negrophilia is one that doesn't receive enough attention. Now, if I'm being honest, I struggled to set a clear boundary so as not to conflate negrophilia with the concept of the Western gaze. These are, in my opinion, two separate concepts that are invariably rooted in fetishization. And when I say fetishization, I'm not referring to the popular sexual definition. Rather, I mean this definition. An unreasonable amount of importance that is given to something, or an unreasonable interest in something, or the reduction of a person to aspects of their body, identity, or relationship structure. I hope that makes sense going forward, but let me continue. Though the word negrophilia is derived from the French word négrophilie, which means love of the Negro, the term was popularly used by avant-garde artists amongst themselves to describe their fetishization of Black or African culture. This dominant culture's fascination, and I use that word very generously, was sparked by anything from inanimate African art objects, l'art nègre, like masks and wooden carvings that were often products of colonial exploitation, to live performances by Black people, really. I think it's important to understand right off the bat that negrophilia was never really about the Negro or loving them, but that it instead served the interests and fascinations of observant white guests. According to Stuart Hall, characteristics that are perceived as African are usually reflected from the European perspective in order to enrich the European identity. Now, in this instance, enrich can take on a number of nuances, ranging from being as sinister as a superiority complex or as benign as trying to find comfort in that which is unfamiliar. Either way, leaning into the stereotypes is one way of really pacifying the Western gaze. Images in the news, popular media, and books often highlight African people living in abject poverty. Rarely do they show the realities of wealth, power, and good health that exist throughout the continent. Typically, African children are depicted as sick and hungry. Rare are depictions of the millions of African children who arrive at school fed and ready to learn each day with a roof over their head. So what? Couldn't we just ignore all of this? Well, firstly, yes, we could, but the stereotypical representations of Africa and its people have a profound impact on different levels. Such deficit images of Africa contribute directly to racism. Historically, these misconceptions have been used to justify enslavement and colonialism. The portrayal of Africa in Western media and children's books continues to feed a belief in white superiority and the need of Africans to be saved or even feared. The happy Negro archetype refers to the notion that African ancestored people are perennially smiling and happy, chiefly because of their childlike grasp of life and extreme religiosity. The trope was seen frequently in both fiction and non-fiction writings, beginning in the early 19th century in both England and the US, where accounts of enslaved people were offered as evidence of the essential, humble, pious, and happy nature of well-cared-for enslaved black people. This trope thus serves to justify race-based slavery and ongoing oppression today. Similarly, in the US, much of the stereotyping of black people stemmed from the slave era, where the popular black caricatures Uncle Tom, Mammy, and Sambo were created to not only justify slavery, but to also demonstrate that black people, in fact, enjoyed slavery. Slave owners took the fact that slaves danced and sang songs as a display of their satisfaction with their lives, when in reality, this was how slaves coped with their mistreatment. We are moving out of and around the continent more now than ever before. Immigrants from African countries often learn very quickly how little the West and the US in particular know about Africa. Those of us in the diaspora are at risk of experiencing firsthand the racism associated with that ignorance. You know the questions we receive about wild animals in our streets, about our huts. If negative stereotypes prevail, then policies that are paternalistic or exploitative are less likely to be challenged. How do we begin to fix this, then, I hear you ask? By challenging the stereotypes. The media need to highlight typical social groups and everyday activities performed by Africans that everyone can relate to. We need to minimize materials that emphasize exotic practices. We need to completely abolish the concept of anything and everything African in the West always being staged under the Western gaze. Of course, it's no longer just the West doing this now. I'm sure we all remember the viral BBC documentary investigated and reported by Runako Selina and Malawian journalist Henry Mango that centered around Lu Ke, a Malawi resident from China who was exposed by BBC Africa Eye for using local children to film personalized greeting videos, many of which included very racist content. He was, of course, paying these children and their parents, so a lot of the wrongdoing was simply ignored for the longest time. But here's why we can't just ignore it, choose to not participate and hope it goes away. It's just as the people behind the orphanages and charities I mentioned at the beginning realize. Blackness often has to be performed in its most reduced form in order for it to be visible or recognizable or get attention from outsiders. Simply existing and going about your day, minding your own business, leaves you at risk of being overlooked. And that's why we have people quite literally dancing for their supper. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. I've been really having a good time creating this content, and I have a lot more lined up for you. So if you're keen, do feel free to subscribe. Also, I would love to engage with you guys on any of these topics, so go ahead and leave a comment and help me grow this channel.